Am I correct, Joe?
Well, partially. Let's go back to 1921 and the appearance of the first unified field theory, which was the work of a German mathematician by the name of Theodor Kaluza. And he'll become kind of important for our story as we go on this evening. What he attempted to do and showed in his paper that he sent to Einstein and that Einstein really liked, as a matter of fact, and eventually allowed to be published, was that he attempted to unify just gravitation and electromagnetism, which he did in a five-dimensional theory. In other words, any unified field theory that we're going to be talking about tonight is a hyperdimensional theory. It works in more than 4 dimensions, 3 of space and 1 of time. And Einstein liked the idea so well, he began to toy with the idea himself because he was, to a certain extent, dissatisfied with general relativity. And he comes out with kind of the first fully fleshed out version of his idea of a unified field theory in 1928. And in this version of the paper, again, he's only dealing with electromagnetism and gravity. And what he does is he incorporates a little mathematical expression called the torsion tensor. And torsion's going to be kind of a theme also tonight. So let's explain what that does. If you think of torsion as kind of a folding and pleating and spiraling of space-time itself. In other words, it's a geometric theory, and torsion simply warps it and spirals it. So if you want to draw kind of a simple analogy to what torsion does, if you take an aluminum soda can and empty it of the soda, and then wring it like a dish rag, what you're going to see is that the can will spiral and fold and pleat, and the ends of the can draw closer together. And that's basically kind of what torsion does to the geometry of space-time itself. It folds and spirals and pleats it. Well, Einstein publishes this theory and numerous other versions of it after 1928. And basically the thrust of my book, Secrets of the Unified Field, is that on one side of the war, the Americans took Einstein's version of this theory, probably the 1928 version with this torsion tensor, and made it the theoretical basis of the Philadelphia experiment. On the other side of the war, the Nazis either took Einstein's or perhaps even Theodor Kaluza's version of the theory, incorporated torsion into it, and made it the version or theoretical basis of their experiment called the Bell. So you have two major combatants in the war basically doing this very, very super secret research on unified field theories. Now there's another person I want to mention, Scott, and he's very important. His name is Gabriel Krohn. He's a Hungarian electrical engineering genius. And in 1935, he publishes a paper in which he demonstrates that some of the phenomena that electrical engineers know very well from working with large, high-power networks and rotating machinery, these machines will exhibit a little kind of anomaly, a creep in the phase of the current that they employ. And he demonstrates in this paper that you cannot explain this phenomenon any other way than by some version of a hyperdimensional unified field theory employing gravity and electromagnetism. And moreover, he demonstrates that torsion is a primary component in this creep. So in other words, you have yet a new force acting in these machines. Now, this paper won him a prize at the University of Liège in Belgium in 1935. Now, this means two things, and it's very, very significant here. Because what Krohn does is he says that all of this high mathematics that you find in these very abstruse unified field theory papers of the late 1920s are, in fact, practical and therefore engineerable. And it's this little paper, I think, that brings these unified field theories to the attention of the Americans on one side of the Atlantic, and most certainly to the attention of the Nazis right across the border, in Nazi Germany. So I think what we have here is a case where Krohn is demonstrating that even though these theories may be incomplete from a a modern theoretical physicist's point of view, they're nevertheless engineerable, and this is the key.
And it seems the Nazis.
Can I ask how this, if it does, because this seems to, I mean, quantum theory and Planck's constant seem to be in opposition here somehow. Is that still considered to be so, or has it been proven otherwise?
Well, the problem with the unified field theories, if you ask a standard mainstream theoretical physicist what the problem with those theories in the 1920s was, and you're correct. The problem was that they did not take into account the forces of quantum mechanics. In other words, these theories were still theories that worked on the physics of the very large. And therefore, a modern theoretical physicist would consider them to be incomplete and therefore not successful theories. But you see, this is the problem in the record. The record shows, and most theoretical physicists are totally unaware of the work of this Hungarian man by the name of Gabriel Krohn. He comes to this country during the war and basically makes his home here and goes to work for General Electric. And his works, if you do a Google search, his works were very popular and very well read, but they're extremely difficult to get a hold of. When I was researching Secrets of the Unified Field, I discovered that one of the books that I was looking for that he had published was only available from a corporate library, and they would only lend it out for a fee of $1,200. You know, talk about an effective way of suppression.
I don't think that's going to happen.
No, exactly.
I mean, that's economic.
Yeah, well,
economic.
Exactly.
That's the. I wonder if we, that. I guess that's the same sort of thing we're going through, trying to get a hold of anything that has to do with Tesla's work.
That's right. It's the same case here, but Krohn is even more significant, I think, in a certain sense than Tesla, because again, let's go back to this torsion tensor for a moment that Einstein incorporates in his 28 unified field theory paper. What this tensor does, what this mathematical expression does, is it not only dispenses with the entire geometry of general relativity, but what it also does is it challenges one of the very fundamental planks of general relativity, and that is the so-called equivalence principle, the idea that inertial and gravitational mass are equivalent. And then secondly, and more importantly, if you look at general relativity, the geometry that Einstein has to assume in order to make that theory work means that there can be no local variations of gravitational acceleration on the surface of a large mass. But with the torsion tensor, he allows that possibility. So in other words, again, both the theory on the part of Einstein and the practical engineering aspect on the part of Gabriel Krohn both indicate that these theories are locally engineerable. Now that means, folks, that in 1935 you have a demonstration that you can engineer gravity and electromagnetism, or in other words, the space-time fabric itself, locally. Now that's a whopper. And you can bet your bottom dollar that in the United States we certainly picked up on the idea that we could use this theory in some respect. And I think this is the ultimate theoretical grounding for the Philadelphia experiment. After all, Carlos Allende in his letters, which I cite extensively in the book, he himself says that this theory was the basis of the Philadelphia experiment. And on the other side of the war, you can bet your bottom dollar that once the Nazis pick up on this idea, they're thinking, well, why are we messing around with atom bombs? We can go for broke and find something that can tinker with the fabric of space-time itself. And that, once you weaponize that idea, you have
you realize that's not that far-fetched, because nowadays the collider, the National Collider they got there, and I believe it's Virginia.
Right.
They're actually creating mini black holes.
Well, this is true.
They're actually doing that right now. So they're playing with the fabric of time-space by doing that.
They're doing so.
Whoa, this is now. Wait a minute. This is confusing me a little bit here. I understand what you're saying, Ed, but doesn't this smack of Heinz theory?
Yeah, they're playing with the fabric of time-space by doing that alone. So what Joe's talking about is not far-fetched by any stretch of the imagination.
Right. Well,
because they're actually doing this stuff now.
Sure. Oh, yes, absolutely. Let's back up, and I'll try and answer both of these things here. The collider experiments and the black hole things, you know, a black hole, a wormhole, if you will, is on a very, very small order of size. It's on the scale of 1 billion times tinier than tiny. We're dealing again with you know, Planck length and very, very small units of measure.
Right.
Torsion, however, is something completely different in terms of the geometry that invokes, because you can apply this at a macro level. In other words, you can do it in the world of ordinary sized objects, and that's the key difference here. It's a totally different sort of geometry than general relativity. But now you asked the question about Burckhardt-Heim, and I do not discuss Burckhardt-Heim in Secrets of the Unified Field. I do discuss him at great length in a new book I have coming out next spring with Farrell House Publishers called The Philosopher's Stone. But basically, Heim, to answer your question, Scott, his theory is a theory that does incorporate not only this unification of gravitation and electromagnetism, but a fully quantized theory. In other words, it deals with the theory of the very small. So it's a very revolutionary theory, too, I might add, because unlike string theory, it is testable and to a certain extent has been verified.
That's interesting.
Oh, yeah.
I love it.
That's bending light, if you will, in order to provide some kind of camouflage, but it certainly doesn't sound like that's what they were really trying to do.
Well, exactly. What I try and do in the book is I go back to the original sources, namely Morris Jessup, the Varro annotated edition of his book, you know, which began the whole Philadelphia experiment story, and which many people have never actually even read portions of. So I do reproduce portions of that very significant work in the book. And I stick very closely not only to those sources, but to the Allende letters. And let's look at exactly what Allende says. Number one, and this is very important, he says that the experiment was performed at sea. In other words, not in a dock in Philadelphia. Okay? Number two, what he says is that for a moment there was complete and total invisibility of the ship, and you could see the outline of the hull in the water. What he does not say is that the ship was teleported magically from Norfolk, Virginia to Philadelphia and back again. He does not say that there were sailors embedded in bulkheads and so on and so forth. So this is very crucial. So if you look at these unified field theory papers of Einstein, if you rationalize the experiment as Allende indicates on the basis of this 28 unified field theory, and that's the one that incorporates this torsion tensor, I believe that what the Navy was after, and if you examine the scientific record, which I do extensively in the book, that what they were probably after was some sort of means of radar stealth camouflage. And of course, what they did, probably, was they performed a few proof-of-concept experiments on a small scale. This is another crucial component of the story, because this is the only way, if you're going to follow the scientific method, that you're going to get up to a full-scale experiment under combat conditions at sea. So in other words, they perform these experiments, they have a degree of relative success, they install this equipment on the ship. The ship is, interestingly enough, when it runs the full-scale experiment, close to Bermuda, you know, which is another little curveball in the story. But when the experiment is actually performed under these conditions, they have unanticipated results that run away.
In other words, they create some kind of a space-time anomaly.
Right. They created total optical invisibility, which would indicate, if you follow the mathematics of this theory, which would indicate exactly what you're describing, a space-time bubble, a space-time anomaly. The experiment ran away from them. They got effects that they were not anticipating. So if we look at the Philadelphia experiment in toto, what we're dealing with is an experiment that was not rationalized out very fully. Now, one of the crucial components of the case I make in the book is that I cite a paper of some modern electrical engineers that performed a small-scale proof-of-concept experiment. And what does occur is a degree of radar deflection. They put an iron block in some salt water that they intentionally made a mixture of brine and so on and so forth, and magnetized it, and exactly the same phenomenon happens as Allende describes. There's a boiling and seething in the water. The water actually flies out of the basin that they're, that they do this in. So you have a rationalization of the invisible hull, that you can see the hole in the water.
Which still displaces the water.
Right,
which means
exactly.
There's something there, but it's not there.
It's not there, right. So in other words, the experiment was rationalized to a degree, but they were not anticipating all the effects that they actually achieved. And I think this is the reason that the experiment is to this day so highly classified. Now on the other side of the Atlantic with the Nazis and their Bell device, you have a much more, I think, thorough grasp on the theory and its implications. In other words, what the Nazis achieved, they were looking for deliberately, and they managed to rationalize things more fully. I think they were using a different version of the unified field theory, namely Kalutz's, because of course he remains in Nazi Germany during the war, and I get into the reasons why I think his theory is the basis for their Bell device. But in any case, you have these two major combatants that have really seized on this idea that even though this theory is incomplete, it's engineerable. And with the U.S. Navy achieving the results that it did, there's no doubt to my mind that they heavily classified it almost immediately. I reproduce the log documentation of Allende's ship that he was on and the crazy, goofy things that are going on in it. It's just an incredible story.
Now, there's two things in here I noticed.
The log of the ship that they used, what was it?
The Eldridge.
The Eldridge has 13 pages missing in their logbook during this test period?
Well, this is another interesting thing. Back in 2003, there were two researchers on Coast to Coast AM by the name of Howard Strom and Deborah Cunningham, and they presented their research in acquiring these logbooks, not only for the Eldridge, but more importantly for the ship that Allende was on, that was part of a convoy coming back from North Africa to North America. And the interesting thing about the logbooks that they ran into was at one point they attempted to get some of the Eldridge logs, and it had been checked out of the National Archives just a matter of days previously by someone in the U.S. Coast Guard. Now, when I read that, I just sort of sat back in my chair, my jaw dropped, I had to take a nice strong swig of coffee. Because if you're going to hide a black project like that, what's the least likely place anyone is going to look, and it's the Coast Guard.
Yeah, the so-called Unreal Navy.
Yeah, the so-called Unreal Navy, Yeah. So, there's every indication, if you examine these documents that I reproduce in the book, there's every indication that a massive cover-up occurred. But there is even something else that kind of threw me for a loop, Scott and Ed, and that was that if you read all this stuff carefully enough, you get the sense that at some point the Navy actually lost control of the experiment, that they're genuinely mystified. They don't know where it is, where it went, and who's doing anything with it. And this to me just absolutely floored me. But, that sense is there. You have to entertain the possibility that this is what happened on the basis of the documents that I reproduce in the book.
Now, let me ask you this.
Again, correct me if I'm wrong. Sorry, Ed, but again, correct me if I'm wrong. But if this type of a space-time anomaly would have occurred, wouldn't there have been some kind of residual effect that we could, in today's technology, qualify, if not quantify?
Well, interestingly enough, there is. Allende mentions that at a point after the experiment, the sailors who had been exposed to the field of the ship that the field was tested on would suddenly and spontaneously either burst into flames or just totally disappear right in front of you if, and this is a key point, if they were exposed to a magnetic field. Now, this is interesting because Allende also uses the expression in one of his letters, I think it's the second letter he wrote to Jessup, where he talks about a field within the field, and sometimes he calls it a hyperfield within the field. Now, if you look at the torsion tensor, this is exactly what it is. It's a field within a field. And interestingly enough, you mentioned Burkhard Heim. One of the interesting things about his theory, and again, I do not talk about him in this book. I do talk about him extensively in the book that's at a new publisher now, is that Heim's theory predicts precisely this sort of coupling between, direct coupling between magnetism and gravity. So you do have the possibility, if you're manipulating gravity, you know, Einstein is correct here, you're manipulating time. So absolutely, if they achieved all these results, they achieved some sort of very weird temporal displacement that no one really knows what happened. And again, I think this is yet another reason that the Navy took such extreme precaution to cover up, you know, what happened when they ran the test at full scale. Again, the experiment ran away from them, and they got results they were not expecting at all.
Well, the disappearing semen, I can understand within that, but the spontaneous combustion, I don't see how that ties in.
Well, this is something that he says. Again, if you expose someone to an extreme field, I can see that they would possibly spontaneously combust or disappear, as he also says. But the thing is that all of these things are indicators, they're little clues as to what the theory was that they used to perform this experiment and the type of equipment that they were using. So again, I think if you take all these little clues, all these little indicators, and add them all together, again, you're looking square in the face of an engineered application of some version of one of Einstein's unified field theories, and the only one that can explain all of these things from a physics and scientific standpoint is precisely this 1928 version that uses this torsion tensor that deals directly with rotating systems.
Kaluza-Klein.
Pardon me?
You mean the Kaluza-Klein theory?
No, I mean Einstein's 28 unified field theory. Kaluza-Klein is a different theory altogether. And let's explain a little bit about the geometry of Kaluza-Klein, because it deals directly, I think, with the geometry that you find in the bell. The Kaluza-Klein theory's geometry is basically cylindrical, okay? Einstein's 28 version theory, the torsion tensor, is the basic geometry of it is a spiraling type of cylinder, or if you prefer, a kind of a donut type of thing. But I think what the Nazis did was they modified Kaluza-Klein with this torsion tensor. And again, I reproduce a case not only in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, but I kind of extend that case in this book, that the geometry of the bell itself, with its two counter-rotating drums, I disagree with Nick Cook and most researchers out there that the bell's counter-rotating drums were nested one inside the other like a kind of a modified plasma focus. I believe that they were positioned one on top of another, so that the counter-rotation of these drums would produce an extreme torsion shear effect in the center of that device.
Yeah, it looks to me like it'd have to.
Oh, yes, exactly. And
you know, the schematics I've seen that you've drawn out, they have to be set up that way.
Right. And the other thing is that Heim theory itself, and I mentioned this again in the new book that's coming out in a few months, Heim theory itself predicts this type of phenomenon will occur if you have counter-rotating fields nested on top of another, one on top of another. You will get an extreme torsion shear effect. Now let's go back to the Philadelphia experiment for the moment. If you rationalize the experiment on the basis of torsion and assume then that they're using these magnetic degaussing cables on the inside of the ship on each of the three axes of the ship, that too, at full power, would possibly set up an extreme shear effect. In other words, they're getting nonlinear effects. They're getting unanticipated results, and this is why the experiment ran away from them.
All right, could that be because they were not properly aligned? Is there some kind of wavelength or something here that could be causing that?
That may be, or they may have set up some sort of resonance effect where you get internal feedback loops within these fields, and again, the experiment crosses some sort of threshold that they had not anticipated, and you get these extreme torsion shear effects, time displacements, time anomalies, and optical invisibility, and so on and so forth. And perhaps, since we're talking about it, perhaps even a minor degree of levitation of the ship itself above the water. All of those things would certainly fall out from the theory. So, again, I think that they hadn't thought things through quite as well as the Germans had on the other side of the Atlantic, but nonetheless they've stumbled across exactly the same thing.
At some point in this too, Joe, you mentioned the different metallic balls that they had with the different resonant frequencies.
The Germans?
And and how they had covered those with rubber. So that,
yes.
Okay. To me, that almost reeks of modern stealth technology. We have this stuff that we paint. we paint the stealth fighters with special rubber paint. I mean, to me, it sounds like they were just on the verge of creating what we have now.
Well, they were not only on the verge, they did create the prototypical technology that we have now. And I mentioned this in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, which is the previous book that I wrote on this subject. The
Germans, you just so well refined it in this new one, Secrets of the Unified Field. It makes so much sense now. Now it's perfect sense that this is exactly what they were doing with the Nazi Bell and the Philadelphia experiment was exactly what they've created, what we're seeing flying around our skies and on our waterways now.
Oh yeah. The radar stealth research begins really during World War II. That's I think the ultimate motivation for the Philadelphia experiment on our part. And certainly the Germans were pressing radar stealth material science vastly far forward during the war. And again, they did create this material. They put it on some of their late war submarines and so on and so forth.
Well, the Horten Flying Wing, excellent example.
And the Horten Flying Wing, all of this stuff. They were very, very well aware of what they were doing and had rationalized their secret weapons projects extremely carefully and to a very detailed level.
But how did these, for our audience sake, how did these metallic balls fit into the picture for our audience sake? So explain to them how that worked.
Okay. Well, the Bell, I believe, was rationalized on the basis of this very hyperdimensional, off-the-books torsion, or if you prefer, scalar physics. Now, what the balls do, what this stealth material did, is that the Germans, during the late months of the war, took a bunch of this material, and they took some of their phased array radars, and yes, folks, I said phased array radars, and mixed, they did wave mixing on this material because the little metal balls that they impressed into this material were of different sizes and different metals that would resonate to different frequencies of Allied radar.
So are these buckyballs you're talking about, or something else?
No. These are just little spherical balls, small little granules of zinc and so on and so forth that they impress into rubber and then bake at extremely high temperature and pressure. And it was designed to deflect or absorb, rather, I should say, the Allied radar frequencies that were coming in, off of Allied radar sets. And since the Allies were using a fairly broad band for the period, that's what they did. They used different sizes of spheres resonant to these different frequencies. So the Germans take their phased radar sets and they beam mix. In other words, they take two or more beams at different frequencies, beam it onto this material to see if they're going to get a radar reflection signature. And what happened was that when they did this, their radar sets were totally and completely destroyed. So what they in effect had done was that they had created a phase conjugate mirror. And for those who don't know what that is, a phase conjugate mirror is a special kind of optical cavity. It's just kind of like a special kind of lens, if you will, or a mirror, that will take the electromagnetic signature of an object that comes into it and reflect it perfectly cohered and time reversed, so to speak, right back on the target. Okay? So that
it's like a sympathetic
it's like
vibration.
a sympathetic, right.
Yeah.
And this is the same type of physics that we see them investigating with the bell, because again, the key to this physics is zeroing out all the vectors of force that come in and impinge on an object. And this is exactly what the bell does, and why it achieves the spectacular results that they wanted it to achieve. So again, we're dealing with yet another country that is fully exploring, and I would argue probably much more fully than the United States was, is fully exploring every little aspect it can think of to tap into and access and acquire a technology that can manipulate the fabric of space-time.
And something that, now, we've talked again many times when it comes to this Bell project, you know, the link between Kecksburg, but there's another interesting player in this whole scenario whose name not only appears in the annals of this subject, but, of course, when it comes to UFOs in general, his name appears at the top of the list when you start talking about things like Majestic 12 and so forth, and that's Vannevar Bush.
Oh, yeah.
Ironically enough, Mr. Bush's name appears right at the top of the list when you start mentioning the Philadelphia experiment.
Oh, wait a minute. That's not the same Bush, is it?
That's Vannevar Bush. That is
Vannevar Bush was President Roosevelt's. He's no relation to the Bush family in the White House.
Thank God. That's what I wanted to know. I was ready to beam them up already.
Now, Vannevar Bush it was number 2 on the Eisenhower's Majestic 12 board there.
He was Roosevelt's scientific czar, and the way he appears in connection with the Philadelphia experiment is that during World War I, Nikola Tesla had approached the then Undersecretary of the Navy, who was exactly Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with an idea for using magnetic degaussing cables for the deflection of torpedoes from German U-boats. And Roosevelt kind of liked the idea, but, you know, they couldn't sell it to the Navy. You know, it was just too advanced and too avant-garde. But, of course, Roosevelt, being so closely connected with Vannevar Bush, most likely would have passed this idea along to Vannevar Bush, so that when World War II comes around and you have Bush in charge of all of these scientific projects, everything from the Manhattan Project to you know, our experiments with jet aircraft and so on and so forth, you would also have him certainly endorsing something like the Philadelphia experiment. And in fact, let's look at it from the standpoint of view of the war. If you have an impending invasion of Europe that you're faced with, and you're going to be sending hundreds of thousands of men across the English Channel to storm Fortress Europe, then it would have been dereliction of duty for the United States Navy not to try to come up with some extremely effective way of camouflaging its ships to whatever degree they could from German radar and from German artillery fire. And again, you know, I think that this is another rationalization for the experiment actually having occurred, because it simply would have been inconceivable for them not to do it.
Well, yeah, you know, if Vannevar Bush was involved in it, it's got to be real. I'm sorry. He had his hand in every. If his name is mentioned, if it had to do with the most advanced technology of the time, and his name was associated with it, it existed. I'm convinced of it. You put his name on technology, it was real. It existed.
Yep.
Because he had his hand in every bit of top secret technology of the day.
Well, now there's another interesting connection besides Bush that I mentioned to the Philadelphia experiment at the very end of Secrets of the Unified Field, and that's Dr. Werner von Braun. And this
yes, number one.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, Mister, I won't work on your space project until you bring my Nuremberg convicted Nazi buddy over.
One and the same. One and the same.
Yeah, well, we definitely are familiar with him.
Well, the connection is this. There's a famous picture that I reproduce in the book that is actually from William Moore and Charles Berlitz's book on the Philadelphia experiment. It's a picture of Dr. von Braun sitting with the Office of Naval Research's, ONR's, Project Vanguard Satellite Committee, okay? And you see a bunch of men in this picture, and von Braun's on the other side of the table, kind of, as if he's holding court. And two of the men that you see in this picture are the two naval officers that received the annotated copy of Morris Jessup's book that first mentioned the Philadelphia experiment. So in other words, you can conjecture that when the Navy prints up the Varro edition and passes it out and circulates it quietly among its top people, that the top people that they're talking about are precisely these people on this committee, okay? Because, of course, anti-gravity and space and all of that's going to be a major concern to the Navy during the period of Sputnik. So, von Braun is therefore very likely to have been one of the people that received a copy of this strange book that first mentions the Philadelphia experiment. So again, we have a major Nazi figure with his hand in a pie that would indicate that there's another technology in play here in the space program almost from the start.
Double hook.
I mean, it just well, when you start dealing with when you start dealing with the topic of recovered Nazi technology and World War II.
We're dealing with recovered Nazis here. I mean, we bought it here and said, "Go guys."
You're talking about Project Paper, everything from prior to Project Paperclip and beyond, for crying out loud.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Gee, no wonder Mr. Bush, and I refer to the grandfather of our sitting president, was on their side.
Right.
Not Vannevar Bush. You're talking about the other Bushes.
Prescott Bush. Prescott.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's yet another little German connection. What amazes me doing all this research is almost everywhere that I turn in doing this research, there's some connection to Germany. Even if I'm talking about the Great Pyramid, there's some.
Geez, they were one of the greatest technical, people of the 20th century.
Right.
And they're not doing too badly now. So
no, they're certainly not. They're certainly not.
We're messing for an Essen.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And if you put all this together, let's kind of put it into kind of a larger context, if we may. You've got these two experiments being run by two combatants in the war, the two major combatants on opposite sides of the war. They're both tinkering around with a technology that, for all intents and purposes, is a technology that can lead to free energy, that can lead to some sort of field propulsion, and ultimately, if you weaponize it, as the Nazis wanted to do, to a weapon that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker.
Well,
so
our friend Tesla was kind of working on the same kind of thing with free energy.
Oh yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the Tesla connection with the Nazi bell is definitely there, because Tesla, late in life, is working on the idea of mixing two different kinds of electrical potential, namely direct and alternating current. And this is exactly what I think and what I talk about in this new book, Secrets of the Unified Field. This is exactly what you see the clues indicating the Nazis were doing with this Bell device. They were using two different types of electrical potential and a lot of other stuff. But the bottom line is that we're dealing with a technology that, if you are serious about space exploration, if you're serious about it, if you really want to get off this world and out of the local Earth-Moon system, then ultimately, my friends, you have to rely on something else other than chemical rockets. And if we look at what Nazi Germany is in fact doing, you have their rocket program with von Braun and his team at Peenemünde. And then you have this Bell device, which is, again, something that definitely had field propulsion implications. So you've got, almost from the beginning of the modern space age in Nazi Germany, you have a two-track program, a secret one that's kind of for show. We're going to bomb London with these rockets. But then you have another one that's so entirely off the books that we don't even find out about it until after German reunification and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain.
Intriguing. And then of course, in this wonderful little mix, we have Foo Fighters, which may in fact have been working models of what they were doing.
Of something. I do think, the whole question of the Foo Fighters is so complex because on the one hand, you do have these indicators the Germans were doing all sorts of very strange stuff, okay?
Not just the people.
Not just the people. And on the other side, you don't have any case where these Foo Fighters actually knocked down an Allied aircraft, except, as I reproduce in this new book, there are intelligence documents that I uncovered that I reproduce in the book that talk of glowing globes in the air and Allied aircraft flying into them and simply and entirely disappearing. They don't crash. There's no debris. They just completely and utterly, totally disappear. They are never heard from again. So in other words, you have yet another little signature indicator that the Germans are experimenting with some extraordinarily advanced concepts and applications in physics that fall out from all of these implications of these unified field theories.
Keep in mind, too, though, that just like I mentioned earlier when we were talking about von Braun and his buddy, they were working at a rocketry camp, which was basically all the people that were in these camps that they were working at and testing their rockets at were all slave labor. Okay, so they were not confined to proper methods and so forth. They wanted to experiment. They didn't send monkeys up in rockets. They just grabbed the nearest slave, shoved them in one of these things, and sent them up.
Right.
So that's the kind of conditions. They were able to think outside of boxes and do experiments outside the box. So they weren't confined to morals and ethics and things like that. So that's the way they did their experiments. And they thought outside the box. They did not have the same conventional testing and so forth that we had on our side.
Well,
and they did a lot of weird, strange things.
Oh, they did.
And
not only that, Ed, we should stress something else, and I'm glad you raised this point. Every single secret research weapons project in Nazi Germany, every single one, was reliant upon this vast slave labor pool.
Yes.
And it was all being coordinated by one man by the name of SS General Hans Kammler. Okay?
Exactly.
And, to put it in size, folks, the German atom bomb scientists, at least, the public consumption history version of it is that they complained that they were never able to achieve an atom bomb because they simply didn't have the labor resources that the Allies had in the Manhattan Project. And I say absolute balderdash. That's complete nonsense. That's a lie and a cover. Because the Germans could call on a slave labor pool in excess of 14 million people. So it's no wonder that you have this vast, sudden explosion of technology and development during the period of the Third Reich, precisely in Nazi Germany, because they are, like you say, they are not only thinking outside the box, but they are not constrained by any moral scruples that a Western Allied scientist would have been.
And unlimited human resources.
And a virtually unlimited pool of test subjects that they can victimize. And this is certainly the case of what we see with the Nazi Bell. They were using slave labor from a nearby concentration camp in this device, not only to test it, on people and so on and so forth, but just as common laborers, for the project. So this is a crucial point to stress.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's a crying shame, but that's where this technology came from.
That's right.
Wasn't part of the problem with the Nazi nuclear project that they had a difficult time generating enough heavy water to complete the experiment?
Nonsense.
No, really?
The entire Scott. One of the things I spent a great deal of time getting into this research is in a book I wrote called Reich of the Black Sun. And I should tell your listeners that there is an internet pirated version out there. Please don't use that. If you're going to consult the book, please get the book. because
the internet version's a piece of crap.
Well, that too, because it's not.
I've seen it.
Yeah, it's not the entire book.
No,
and it doesn't have the pictures that I put in the book. But basically, Scott, I've come to the conclusion that the entire Allied post-war legend about Nazi nuclear incompetence is just that. It's a legend and nothing more. They were far more successful in their A-bomb project than we have been led to believe, and that's one of the great untold stories about the war.
So basically, we just got very, very lucky.
We just got very lucky, yes. And, you know, the one that kept harping on this right up to the end of the war was none other than General Patton. I begin the SS Brotherhood of the Bell by even citing from his war diary from January 4th, 1945. Now, by that point, you'd think the Third Reich is all but finished. But General Patton's writing in his private diary, you know, and he says it very bluntly, as was his wont. He says, we can still lose this war. Now, the question is, why would a man that, you know, is the epitome of cold calculation when it comes to military assessments, why would he be coming up with a private reservation like that? And the only way to rationalize it is that you cannot look at the picture of the conventional arms and operations associated with them at the end of the war. There's something else in play, and it's all of this vast secret Nazi weapons technology. You know, the problem that I came to the conclusion that the Germans had was not that they didn't have the atom bomb. It's just that they did not have an effective way to deliver enough of them to start targets on the Allied side that were strategically important enough to be worth the effort.
It wouldn't have been worth the effort unless they had an intercontinental ballistic missile.
Or that they had sufficient stock and sufficient long-range bombers, which they certainly did, by the way, to strike a blow at the eastern coast of the United States, and there's every indication that they were getting ready to do precisely that. So,
there wouldn't have been any way in those days to deliver it via suitcase like we can today, because they didn't have miniaturization capabilities.
Well, there's another problem.
Okay.
There is another problem.
Since we're down to 4 minutes, we may need to leave that one for another show.
Okay, that's fine. My website is www.gizadeathstar.com, and that, again, it's all one word and it's all lowercase.